Hello and welcome to Personable, a podcast focused on speaking to the world's best, enabling you to become the best that you can be. My name is HarveyBracken-Smith, and today I'm honored to be joined by David Esposito. David is the president and CEO of ONL Therapeutics. ONL Therapeutics is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company committed to protecting and improving the vision of patients with retinal disease. He was the former CEO of Armune BioScience. He was also the president of Phadia US Inc. And he's also was a combat veteran who led an infantry platoon with the 101st Airborne Division through several combat operations. I'm incredibly excited to speak to David today. I wanted to get started by asking you, why did you join the Army?
Sure, Harvey. Well, that's a big question to start with. All right. No, glad to be on your show. As a kid growing up, I grew up in New Jersey. West Point was just farther north of that. And, over time, I just felt the calling to serve the United States in a capacity and wasn't from a military family, but really caught the bug. I went up there I was a pole vaulter in high school that had summer track camps up at West Point, and that really caught the bug to say, boy, maybe that's a good thing to pursue. And, just always felt like a calling to serve this country was important to me. So that's kind of how I got my start.
I think it's obviously coming from the UK, from my perspective, there's been a very different sense of what it means to serve your country. Because in America, having studied for a few years at Duke, there's a strong sense of patriotism. But I think particularly in the UK, over the past few years, that level of patriotism has diminished. In fact, in the past government, the Conservatives, they were planning on potentially implementing national service to try and get more national identity. Why do you think there is such a strong national identity in the US? And why do you think there is this strong focus on putting the country first before the person?
I think, got a long history, not just the United States. I think various social movements in the world, I think their rallying cry is when people really see a cause greater than themselves that they want to serve for. And I think the United States, boy, if you look at Great Britain back in World War II and all the things they did, there's just, there are times become a rallying cry towards service of something bigger than yourself. And I think the United States has a wonderful history of that, as do many countries that way. And, I think, Harvey, as you've seen it too, there's a lot of things moving much faster and more complicated these days than perhaps there was even when I was growing up. But I think still, at the end of the day, people gravitate towards a mission or a calling that's something bigger than themselves. It's very purposeful work, and I just hope more people continue to think that way.
Yeah, there's a very strong attitude in the US with regards to veterans. Well, thank you for your service. I feel like that's a thing I should have said in the intro. But I think that's a very lovely thing within a country for the people that put their lives on the line to protect the country and to protect the West. It's something that they should be rewarded for, even if it's just a discount at a shop, or the idea of having valor and being able to respect those that did extraordinary things. What was that sort of idea of what service meant to you before you went to West Point, before you joined the Army? And then what was it like having done it, having actually gone into war zones, having faced combat, having been put in high pressure situations? Could you explain that difference, both from what you went through in your own journey and the advice that you'd give to someone else potentially wanting to do the same?
Sure. I think if I remember right in your background, you're a big athlete too. Growing up playing sports, there's that camaraderie around very difficult physical conditions that people learn sacrifice and service. And I think, on the fields, whether it was football field or wrestling mat or track and field, that you learn those important aspects of serving and kind of physical effort to get things done. I think that set the stage for me and for other veterans. It's a very similar calling of rallying a team together to accomplish a mission. Nothing great happens by yourself, and I think those building blocks in my journey of team sports and then ultimately at West Point in the Army, it's a calling to work together as a team towards a common mission. And I think those are now kind of attributes going forward, building a small biotech team and the complexity of that. Very similar, that, hey, we've got to work together to accomplish a key mission. So I think those are pretty consistent themes in my journey that I would say would be applicable to a lot of folks. Doesn't necessarily have to start in team sports, but that view on just the humility to know that you can't do it on your own, and that if you build a team together, that kind of energy can accomplish great things. And military taught me that. So did corporate America, big companies I worked for, but so did early stage biotech companies.
I want to put a little more focus on your time in the army before moving on to your business career. And something that I find kind of interesting, as you brought up with my own association with playing sports throughout the years. And I kind of found that the better I got at sports, the more experience I got, the more I spoke up, the more I strategized, the more that people respected me. And when I became captain and president at Duke, people would actually listen to what I was saying. But there'd be situations where, even though I knew what the right thing was to do, because people didn't respect me enough or people didn't think I was good enough, they wouldn't necessarily listen to what I was supposed to do. And within the stakes of a rugby game, right, if there's two different opposing people on a team, the biggest risk or biggest downside is that we potentially lose a game, we lose a few points, and we move on to the next one. But when you're in an army situation, if you have an opposing voice, you might have a common goal of getting out alive or successfully completing a mission, but people might have different means to get there, and that can actually lead to high risks from people getting abandoned, from people getting hurt, or even losing their life. So when you're in those high pressure situations where people have a common goal but different means to get there, and you may have opposing voices, how do you go about navigating those high stakes situations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the military, but I, parlay that to where a lot of different situations. I do think it starts from some of the basics. If there is time to develop that plan and vet that plan, it's really important for leaders to be listening to a variety of point of views. And when you have a time to make that plan and do that, I think that's important, and to need to get those point of views. But ultimately, at some point, the plan has to get executed, and that's where when you think about things of culture and realizing there's a mission bigger than yourself is really important, because even in certain disagreements on technique, I'd call it. It's one of the things they teach hard in Ranger School. There are certain principles that don't get violated. There may be techniques to accomplish things, but the guardrails of principles got to keep aligned. And I think that's part of a bit of a military background too. Is there's an essence of we got to fall in line and execute this thing. When there's time for debate, we'll debate, but at this point, we're executing. And so I think that's a really important point. When there's time for debate, have it, but when it's time to execute, you got to implement. But also, even in the thick of challenging situations, a leader has to stay open and alert. In my own time in biotech, but also in the military, what are the data points on the battlefield, or what are the data points today in my current job that may cause us to change course? You got to stay open to that, but many times in the real thick of it, you're executing based on the plan that you outlined. And that's where rehearsals and discipline, all that stuff takes into play.
We spoke a little bit beforehand, because I'm currently in Sydney, Australia. You've spent some time working in Australia as well, and in this wider region. And just before I started studying here, I've maybe been here for 2 or 3 months now. I originally came out with my family for a holiday, and we were looking, and we went to the Northern Territories, and we, I think it was like Cairns or Port Douglas or something like that, and there were basically crocodiles in the region. And we went on like a tour with a tour guide, and I couldn't really understand the fact that there were crocodiles in the sea, and so it was dangerous to go swimming because there's crocodiles there. I couldn't really understand that people, would they leave them in the sea, would they not? People could get hurt, but there was not that many people got hurt. Basically, the reason I bring that up is he said that it trained people to be a bit more precautious. People were more respectful of one another, because even though there was only maybe one person a year or one person every couple of years that would die by a crocodile, it would make people respect one another much more. It would make them respect the land a lot more. And so there's a similar notion with the idea of war, right? You kind of set out those similar principles that you had, that despite the conflicts within the social dynamics, you've got your life on the line, right? So how did you navigate going from this level of respect, this level of rules, this level of both social respect and quite literal rank within an army, to navigating to citizen life, in which those same threats of your life aren't really there on a day-to-day basis? People might not have the same level of respect. or even the same level of discipline and urgency towards common goals? Like more broadly, what was that transition like?
Yeah, great question. I went from being around a lot of people in an environment of the Army and teams, whether it's a platoon leader or executive officer, and then all of a sudden I'm a lone sales rep driving in rural America, in rural Louisiana, calling on docs, all by yourself for a while. So, that in and of itself of a team effort to a relatively single sales rep calling on a lot of clinicians for a while, that in and of itself was a change. But I think the heart of your question, I would say, the principles of leadership hold true, and I would say still the common theme of the infantry is follow me, do as I do. So I think that whether you're a leader of a big team, small team, or navigating life, the ability to just step up and do what you feel is the right thing to do and execute that, lead by example, is a critically important point. And I think that helped me transition into corporate America life too, that I still want to lead by example. That's a really important piece. But then it also gets to, what are the goals, what are the objectives, and how do you align around those things, either individually or when I eventually got into more management and senior management roles. But I think the bedrock of that is you got to lead first. You got to really step in and do the work yourself first to set that example.
Common sort of dynamic of something I think about a lot is the kind of conflict and combination between motivation and discipline. In that motivation is sort of the goal that you initially have. I want to run a marathon, or I want to become the CEO of a pharmaceutical company like where you're at now, or I want to grow a podcast. But the discipline being the day-to-day reps that get you there, and it's sort of the culmination of the small steps that you get you to that place. And as I've kind of navigated, so my area of interest lies more within sort of finance. I'm interning at Goldman Sachs for sales and trading next summer. And I spoke to a few people who had actually been in the army and who had done service. And what I found very fascinating about speaking to them, or even speaking to people that knew them, is that they had kind of an element of discipline before everyone else. They were in the office before everyone else. They left after everyone else, because no matter what they did, the comparable level of sense of urgency, lack of sleep, doing whatever it took to get the job done was so much greater as it was in the army than it was in citizen life. Did you kind of find that there was a similar thing when you entered citizen life? And how was it in having to get your own sense of urgency to get yourself to want to win, to work hard, to complete business objectives when your life isn't really on the line on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, no, terrific question. I mean, I do think what you described is really important, that there are that discipline of building blocks over time to ultimately accomplish a goal is incredibly important. I do think mine and probably other folks that have served too, there does become an element of pushing your body much further than you could ever think. Your tolerance for pain and endurance and difficulty, that becomes a pretty high bar, at least in my experience and others in the military. And so I do think that translates to corporate America in many ways, and that the importance of that, getting the work done, you described work ethic and hustle are all critically important for that. And I think those are very translatable skills that are important to it. But I would say, Harvey, what's interesting about maybe as we started this discussion, the journey of learning on an athletic field, then in the military, there's an element of physical strength that comes in play on those. And I'd say in corporate America, there's the need for that strength for endurance, but it is a competitive marketplace. You've got to work hard, be on top of your game, learning and growing constantly to be able to win in a corporate environment, because people can bring a lot of smarts to the table, and it's not about how many push-ups you can do, it's how long can you sustain that level, So I think it's an important journey for people to be on. But I just highlight what you said that's really important. It is not just getting motivated about the long-term goal. It's actually loading the wagon every morning when you got to do it. That's what you got to do. And eventually you look back a handful of years and you're hopefully closer to that destination.
Yeah, I think my this isn't meant as a target at you at all, But I remember asking my dad when I was younger, because my dad also works in finance, and I was kind of like asking him, Dad, like what makes the people get the most senior jobs, right? Is it IQ? Is it how hard they work? What is the key sort of determining factor? And of course, many CEOs have got high IQs, they've worked hard, they've gone to great schools, etc. And many of them are. But he actually said there are a lot of CEOs and people in high positions who just do a good job consistently for a long period of time. They don't outperform and then run off to another company. They don't do really well, then really badly. They're just trickling, really good consistently over time. And I think that's a very interesting sort of way to think about life, because if you stop, you're no longer getting that compounded interest in terms of what you learn and benefit. It's like with the company you run, I don't know how much you're involved in the day-to-day operations, which we can get onto more later. But there are a lot of roles in which, for example, Elon Musk with Tesla, right? He's been given a $1 trillion pay package to kind of 8x the market cap of Tesla, to get like 1 million Optimus robots, to get 1 million robo-taxis. And so there's actually, from a day-to-day basis, he's both got to do a lot consistently and do it really well. But for the most part, it's just about achieving those goals. So you mentioned that after you left the army, you became what you called a lowly sales rep. Could you talk to me a little bit about your career journey from becoming a sales rep to getting into the healthcare industry and getting into the position you're in today?
Sure, yeah, I'll give you a quick version. So as I got off active duty, I became a sales rep for a large pharmaceutical company for Merck and started selling, and I think for many, I didn't have a science background at the time, and so many entry level jobs like that, critically important. How a product enters into a customer's atmosphere and environment is really important. So I started out as a sales rep that way, really enjoyed it. It was very foundation building for me in terms of bringing products to market, meeting customer demand, handling problems, all of those things that the further removed you get into a headquarters environment, you don't feel the pain of that. Very similar. I was a frontline infantry guy. Same thing. It's you want to know what's going on, ask the people on the front lines. You want to know what's going on, ask what a salesperson shaking hands with a customer every day. And so that was very very foundational building for me in my career. But then I did have a desire to lead teams and lead people, and so the natural progression in a large company typically made some journeys back to headquarters to learn marketing and manage care pricing, then come back out to the field and manage sales teams. And you do that over the course of I stayed with Merck for about 16 years, a couple of years every packing up and moving. You get that kind of broad commercial experience of leading big teams, big brands, and then end up commercial strategy. That was the first part of my career that was very important in terms of building those disciplines. And then I really took a hard look at what I wanted to do and learn and grow, and I felt like there was a lot more in healthcare to learn and grow. It was a pretty big transition at that time where a lot of large pharma companies were really outsourcing innovation and typically buying privately held companies over time. And I made a move to run a diagnostics business that was a privately held business. And that started my journey 15 years ago of building early stage biotech, therapeutic, diagnostics companies, and then ultimately either exiting those to a larger company or continuing to fund and grow those. And that's been a part of my journey, about half in large companies, half in small ones. And we could certainly talk about the details. I've had a couple good runs with companies. I've also taken a few into bankruptcy. When you get into this early stage world, Harvey, not everything works out. And that's one thing I'd maybe comment to you on your description of this kind of slow, steady climb versus these dash and flash. The highlight reel on Instagram or CNBC or something like that always seems like it's just some overnight success. It blew up and it went great. That's not the practical reality for most, whether it's a career or a company. You just keep grinding and keep grinding and keep grinding. And eventually, you hope most of the time you get towards those goals.
I have about that was a very incredible explanation of that. And I think that's something I've really been trying to get into the depth with these recent podcast interviews. And it's actually why I kind of do these long form, mostly unedited podcasts, is because I think it gets you to understand the essence of who a really successful person is. Because I think a misconception that I had when I was growing up is that these incredibly successful people were kind of just picked out of a lottery hat, or that they had the right connections. I thought that connections were fixed. I thought, go to the right family, right school, and you'll be successful. But that couldn't be further from the truth. And a lot of what people have said about success, whether being an athlete, a musician, an actress, a CEO, is that hard work, that no one sees, is a big underpinning of that. But there's kind of like quite a few different ways that I want to go off that before getting into the exits. Something you mentioned was that you spent 16 years at Merck. Do you think there are a lot of benefits to staying in one company over time? I think there's kind of a trend with Gen Z in particular of only staying in a company for 2 years max, and building more of a portfolio career. Like, what do you think of the benefits are of staying in one company? And if you were, in my generation at 21 years old now, do you think you would do the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna have 4 children, all of working age, so I've had this dialogue to them as well. And I think it's a little bit of kind of, I'll say, generational and market dependent. So you think about that post World War II generation was, hey, I'm going to work hard, and they were dominant large companies globally that didn't have much competition, and it made for a wonderful career path to just journey along 30 years in a, you think about kind of the American auto industry, the dominance in the 50s and 60s, and then started to lose ground. So I think there was a bias towards staying and learning and growing in a company that had dominant position. I was kind of a mix into that. I grew up with that kind of mindset, thinking, boy, that's what you do, right? You work with one company for forever. And then I left after 15, 16 years with a big company. I came to realize, Harvey, probably a click behind most, but the world's moving faster, and there's benefits to having a lot of experience. And I would say, and so I took a path of gaining some different experiences more in early stage, and how to raise capital, how to bring in and propel innovation quickly. But I would say those choices are, one, very personal, because everybody's got to make those choices their own. They're very productive, purposeful roles for a 30, 35-year career journey in a Merck or some of these big companies. It's a wonderful journey for that, and you had a lot of value. And then there's also the folks that want to move around a little bit and gain that. I will say there's a greater appreciation now for people that have probably had multiple experiences, 4 or 5 years in there. When I was growing up, that was kind of like, what are you, job hopping? You're kind of not. But I think now there's a recognition for diverse set of experiences being very valuable to a company. But at the end of the day, it gets pretty complicated and personal. It's not all about your career or eventually. Married with 4 kids, you got to make some trade-offs sometimes. Where packing up every 2 years maybe not the most productive thing for the household too.
What you said with regard to the dominance of these companies really kind of came to me, because something I hadn't really thought about was it was just because these companies were so incredible that it was kind of by necessity that a lot of people stayed there rather than choice. Like, I always kind of just presumed it was a choice element in that, there are a ton of companies as we see today. You've got the OpenAIs, you've got the Google Geminis, then you've got like the search engines, you've got the social medias, you've got the investment banks, the pharmaceutical companies. And so even someone in the top 1% has got so many options, when back in the day, like, there were only so many, car companies, there were only so many pharmaceutical companies. And so with that increase in competition, there's actually more optionality. And so, yeah, maybe you weren't locked into that base, but, with globalization, there's a lot more applicants as well. So there's a lot more people to fill those roles. There are so many topics that I want to delve into on this podcast. So I'm kind of just going to hit 4 at you at once. And you don't have to go into them specifically, but just kind of from a top-down level. As someone that's not in the pharmaceutical company, something I've kind of noticed a little bit in terms of maybe not even pertaining to your specific products, but just kind of on the whole, is something I've noticed that for specific, creams, gels, tablets, medications, whatever it is, there is an element of advertising to it. And so there's an extent to which people might use the word health in the name, or like get well or whatever, even though like I know there's a lot of regulations on that as well. So you mentioned before you had a big focus on marketing. To what extent, like, how do you go about selling in the pharmaceutical industry? Things like Ozempic, when people are kind of defining the narrative for you, how do you go about reclaiming the narrative for yourself as a pharmaceutical company, how do you go about pricing? Because I know that from a consumer standpoint, particularly with like cancer medications, this can be life-saving for someone, but at the same time, the shareholders need to be able to make money. And the last point, which is less relevant to selling Ozempic and pricing, is why stay connected to the boots on the ground, because a CEO is often deemed as more disconnected from the people working. So yeah, it was selling, Ozempic, pricing, and boots on the ground, if you've got all of that.
Yeah, no, it's a great volley of questions. So if I slip on a few, feel free to pound me back in line. I think at the end of the day, with regards, so there's various regulatory bodies across the world in terms of how you market these things. I think the principles I spoke of earlier, the high watermark, are kind of a very balanced promotion of what's the target audience, target market, target patient type for that product. What has it clinically demonstrated? Not some, sometimes you see these kind of fly-by-night ads for nutraceuticals or, your non-FDA regulated brands. You wonder, what are they really studying? So good hard science data, balanced in a way that what is the efficacy of that product, what's the safety of that product, in a good balanced message, I think is very important. Because the reality is, Harvey, whether I'm running a biotech company now, I ran a few diagnostic companies, nothing is perfect out there. I had a cancer predictive index company we developed for prostate cancer. It wasn't perfect, but you have to promote in that balanced manner. This is the right fit and how to do that. And so I think that's very important, whether it's a drug or a diagnostic, to speak to the balance of the positives and perhaps the negatives of it. I think then there's the themes of, at least in the United States, of direct to consumer advertising versus through a learned intermediary like a physician telling you what product they ought to be on. We haven't got it always right in the U.S. You see a lot of ads these days trying to highlight a product, and people are dancing around singing. It's like, what does that have to do with the data and the efficacy of the product? I get it, but I'm a brand guy too. But you got to wonder, what's the real balance in that? So I think those are important. It dovetails a little bit to your pricing scenario. I firmly believe free markets should be able to reward innovation, and that reward sometimes comes from risk capital. Companies in they're all venture capital funded. It starts off with small investors like you and I putting 5 or 10 grand into a company, and then before you know it, you're raising 60 million. But it starts that way. So that risk capital has to be rewarded for innovation, and so that's where the good, I think, healthy debate on the pricing of these products. I mean, I'm in vision care now, so it is hard to think about a price of protecting your vision. You're a young, healthy guy. I'm not young, but I'm kind of healthy. But you lose your vision and you still got 10, 20 years to live. That's one of the greatest fears of mankind. So you want to price that appropriately, that recognizes the value. But I would say also you can look across the globe, right? There's various pricing structures, and at the end of the day, free markets need to be positioned to reward innovation, and usually you land in a good point with prices that way to do that for sure. Your comment on kind of boots in the ground, if I missed one, I'll go to what's important. So, as a CEO, but whatever level I've been at, I always feel like you need to be close to the front line to really understand what's going on. So that diagnostic company I mentioned, I was not only the CEO, I was the chief sales rep, chief fundraiser, and operations. It's like, so it's an important part of it. I think that front line with customers is where not only you can understand how best position the product, but also, Harvey, it gives you the insight as to what their next problem is that you can solve and build a solution for. So and that's a little bit of the dynamic sometimes you see in large companies. You do have a fair amount of internal grind on motion that is not necessarily value adding to the product line. And that was a big insight for me coming from a large company, spending 15 plus years, now 15 years in early stage. There's no room for wasted motion in the early stage. You can grind on things, but in big companies sometimes you can wait for the quarterly operating review to start thinking about stuff. And in an early stage company, you got to be a little bit more decisive. If I missed a few of those points, feel free to backtrack me on it, Harvey.
You actually handled that question very well. You kind of touched on all of them, and I kind of want to go off the back of what you said with regard to pricing and risk, to put into more perspective from viewers, because I think people, there's a big uptick. There's always kind of been with college-age students being particularly left-wing, this idea of socialism. You see all these tragedies in the world, you see all the bad things going on, and so you're like, why wouldn't a good person just give this for free? But there's kind of two perspectives that I wanted to add. The first one being, right, if you were to imagine, this is a listener, right, you had $300 million, right, you have $300 million in your bank. The first thing you'd probably do is you wouldn't tell anyone and you just keep it yourself, and you'd go off and, sunbathe on some private island. But there are investment funds, pensions, etc., that do have those large amounts of money. And they might go, maybe that's 1% of a big pension fund, and they might give that to a pharmaceutical company, and they'll say, hey, this is high risk, but we want to try and turn this 300 million into 3 billion, right? 10x. This will lead to more money for the people with the pensions, more money for the investment fund, and overall, give them more money to help them in their retirement. So they'll go to the pharmaceutical company, who will then have to do some very high risk trials, right? Because in order for the free market system to align prices that work accordingly, you've kind of got to do something that hasn't really been done before. And so with regard to what David was saying before with the testing, you don't know if it's going to work. So you might launch a new drug with a new trial, spend tens of millions, hundreds of millions on a drug, and you might have to completely scrap it. And so with a lot of these big pharmaceutical companies, they're making all of these bets as if they're like their own venture capital fund betting on these different drugs, so that if one was to succeed, right, if only one drug out of 40 succeeds, the level of returns they've got to make for that have got to make up for all 39 of those other failed investments and make money back, so it's even worth to make the investment. Otherwise, the innovation doesn't happen in the first place. The second thing is there was a big story in the UK during the start of the COVID pandemics, and I think it was like these ventilation systems were incredibly expensive, and within like a week, two Mercedes engineers designed this cheaper ventilation system across the US and across the UK, and basically saved a ton of lives. And it was the same question, right? Like, why aren't these the most smart, intelligent people on the planet? Why aren't they helping everyone else? But if you were to imagine your own 40 hours in a week, right? Are you spending 40 hours those hours working, or are you spending 10 of those hours doing charity work? Are you contributing to helping people and stuff? And it's the same level of incentives for people with these more bigger stakes, whether running a pension fund, whether running a pharmaceutical company, because they've all got employees that they need to pay for and help as well. I wanted to add that perspective because I think there's a misnomer in which people think that, there's just unlimited amounts of money. Someone like Elon Musk with his share in Tesla, he's just got all this money around. And maybe Elon Musk does have all money around, but I think there's these misconceptions around money which people have. On that point, there's a big podcast I look up to called Diary of a CEO by a guy called Stephen Bartlett. He's got like 12 million subscribers, and I'm a big fan of him and the work that he's done. But more recently, to drive clicks, to drive engagement, he's used more controversial titles, right? You see it with Fox News, you see it with CNN as well. These more extreme stories are what get people to actually click. But what it does is it kind of invokes extremism in people, because they might just see a headline or they might just see a snippet, which makes them have a certain view on what Ozempic is or what a certain drug is just based off a headline. How do you balance and what advice would you give for listeners in wanting to get more educated about healthcare drugs in terms of their efficiency levels, in determining whether certain drugs are healthy for them and their kids to take, without merely looking at big podcasts or big Fox News or CNN, which are just trying to drive clicks to make more money?
Yeah, I'd say, Harvey, it's gotten a lot harder over the last handful of years. It is hard to find the truth on a couple things. So maybe I say maybe a few comments, one maybe high level, then maybe one kind of practical. I think, at the end of the day, innovation drives our civilization forward. You mentioned Elon Musk a couple times. I mean, there's a rationale for reusable rockets and getting to outer space. There's a rationale for electric cars that he's transformed the industry on. In my world, there's a rationale for innovating in healthcare. You mentioned COVID. If we didn't have rapid deployment of vaccines and all those things, a lot more lives would have lost. And then you take that to technology or defense, right? There's just innovation drives better livelihood and civilization. So, and that innovation doesn't come without risk. Your point, whether it's venture capital investment in private companies to drive drug discovery or pharmaceutical companies, it's high risk. The vast majority of endeavors don't work out in terms of a successful product. So at a high level, for just the audience to appreciate the journey of drug discovery or of any of these innovations, it's high risk. You only read about the successful ventures. You don't read about the millions lost on others. You know, like I said, I've taken a few companies into bankruptcy. It happens. So I think that is a high level point for people to just appreciate the journey of innovation. It takes bold, courageous entrepreneurs, and it takes people willing to risk capital. And that starts with folks like you, me, and the neighbor next door writing a $5,000 check to get an idea going. That's the way, that part of it. But to your question on how do you get through the data to realize the truth in some of these things, it is really hard. Sometimes traditional medicine doesn't fully appreciate things like certainly diet, exercise, healthy eating, all those things that you know to be true, but doesn't incorporate a holistic view in medicine. Hey, take a couple pills, you'll figure it out. You know that. So I think that is very tough. It does. The benefits of a lot of online communication is you can search hard to get some of it, but finding that piece of truth is good. That's why, again, that learned intermediary, not perhaps the internet or the news channel, but your local pharmacist, your doc that you go see. I mean, that's why that's still a very valued profession of those, because it is hard to sift through all of those things. And I'd say we haven't gotten it right, you know, but it is, Harvey, I'd much rather have the appetite for a lot of information and sort through it than get a very narrowed, filtered view and wonder if you're ever getting the full story. It comes with a little bit of healthy tension trying to figure it out, you know. But it does put the onus on folks like you and me and everybody else. I can't just kind of bumble along. I got to do a little bit of my own research as best I can.
Yeah, not to make this really deep and personal too quickly, and this doesn't relate to any companies that you've worked at, but my mum unfortunately had cancer and passed away from it. And actually during her cancer journey, she took a very holistic view in terms of health. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, so maybe you can ignore this advice. But something that she very much focused on was, it's not just about the treatment that I'm getting, but how can I eat healthier foods? How can I optimize my sleep? In terms of, these people are telling me that this treatment works or there's a % chance of working, right? But there's still the ones that didn't work. So what happened with the ones that didn't work, and what can I then do differently in order to have a better chance of that working? Even from a spiritual level or a religion level, right? Whether you believe in God or not, that can both be a great way to encourage yourself to get through treatment and to keep fighting for another day. But it also leads to, not a medical expert, it also can lead to changes within your body for your body to have a level of belief that you can get over the illness you're facing. And I think, I think this has always been a thing, but people think that a lot of things are very black and white. I had a guest last week called Meg Fair, who's known as one of the best parenting experts in South Africa. She's written 8 books on it. And she kind of talked about parenting being what's known as the gray area, in that when you're raising a child, there is no black and white on what to do. It's sort of in the middle. And I would say that when overcoming an illness, it's a similar thing, right? Of all the patients that you may have in a study, even giving people a placebo, right? There are still people that will get over something, even though the specific medicine is not what got them through it. And so I think that level of nuance and understanding of, okay, here's someone saying this is why it works, but also listening to someone why it doesn't work, and use those informed critical perspectives is very important. Which leads me to something else. And also, I'm not trying to drive extreme clickbaity titles, And I don't want to go into too many details on it. But there was a very unfortunate assassination last year, and we don't have to talk about the specific case, but there's a very much a kind of pent up aggression of people towards the pharmaceutical industry. I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about the misconceptions that people might have that aren't, don't have anyone working at a pharmaceutical company, haven't heard from a pharmaceutical CEO before, and aren't hearing from the people with the boots on the ground, but just hearing these secondhand experiences. Could you talk a little bit about, the misconceptions of the pharmaceutical industry?
I'd say one is a little bit to my comments earlier, like innovation makes our lives better, and innovation in healthcare makes us healthier, live longer, feel better, prosper, all those things. So it's an important part to innovate. The second piece to that is it is not easy innovating. You look at the journey of discovery on great breakthrough medicines. It's not easy and it's not fast, but it matters. And so there's a lot of work towards that. And there's also a lot of failure. And so I think for people to really appreciate it's not easy work, and it takes a lot of risk and a lot of energy to get there is very important. We can probably have a decent debate about the pricing of drugs, the middleman handovers, whether it's insurance, PBMs, all of that. In the U.S. has a bit more complications because of a free market, but ultimately the value of that medicine is best derived by the free markets, and then ultimately, with a policy that can enable access to medicines. If you talk to most people, they'll gripe about their out-of-pocket costs for medicine, and it's a bit baffling in the U.S. You pay an insurance premium all the time, and then your doc orders the medicine. You got another layer of a premium on a copay that you can't make. So I think there are some of those things that are legitimately ripe to describe, but I think for the general public to appreciate. Our livelihood is better today than it was 100 years ago because of innovation in healthcare. We should keep that going because it ultimately will help the generations beyond us get better. And I'm a firm believer that free markets will eventually land in a good spot on the right pricing of that. And we should have a solid open access for people that need the meds. And it's worthy of discussion on it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, even to that point, going back to my mum, there was a drug she tried at the end, which I think had only like a 25% chance of working for a terminally ill patient. And the very fact that that drug was even around, I mean, she was so grateful for it, even though it didn't end up working out. If the level of innovation, trialing, and testing wasn't there, I don't think it had even been fully released to most of the public yet. The very fact that she'd been able to have the opportunity to have it, and which would eventually, as more people get it, the cost would go down. There'd be even improved drugs over time. That's what enables more people to live. I actually was same thing from the Meg Fair podcast. Was people kind of had this worry about vaccines leading to potential autism in children, and she dispelled that myth. It's not true. And a reason I bring that point up is when you think about things like polio, measles, and all the different vaccinations that you might have as a child. All of these people that previously would have had these visibly obvious illnesses and disabilities caused by things which now easily, you can easily just get a vaccine for it. These were things that people would have struggled with, and without that level of innovation and capitalism, that wouldn't have occurred. You mentioned that you've both gone bankrupt and been very successful in terms of financing projects. I want to ask you another holistic question. Specifics don't matter. But in terms of building an exit, running a pharmaceutical trial, hiring the right people, generating an edge, differentiating yourself, what are the business aspects towards taking risk, whether it means raising capital, hiring, developing an edge, launching a new critical trial? How do you go about forming that in your mind, developing a plan, and then getting that down from the top down from you into your teams?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, it does start with what's the problem we're trying to solve. So in a couple of my companies, one was, prostate cancer risk assessment. How better can we do that? Right now it's on things like glaucoma, dry age-related macular degeneration. So what's the problem we're trying to solve? And then what is, not to get too much into the weeds of science, but what's the most practical way to try to solve that problem? I'd say, that what's the problem we're trying to solve is very important. And because that then, Harvey, begins to build the foundation of the calling, of the mission to solve that problem, right? So that begins the energy to your mom's unfortunate passing of cancer, but that's purposeful work to find cancer therapeutics. Same thing with us. So that kind of identifying the problem creates the rallying point. Then I think where many times it breaks down is that you then have to take that energy around that calling to accomplish that, to address that problem, and break it down into bite-sized chunks that eventually become an operating plan. All the things they're teaching in business school. All right, what are the objectives for this year? What are we going to measure against that? How does the team break that down? That becomes the fundamental operating plan to accomplish that big thing. And then the practical side of ensuring everybody on the team sees how their role, what they do, ties to that objective, fits into that operating plan to accomplish that long-term goal. If you can sync all that up, you keep that energy going, then people see themselves that they matter to the team, they matter to the purpose of the journey, and they give a good effort when they have a leader that's coaching them and guiding them to that. And then it gets to how to raise capital for that. Investors are pretty knowledgeable. They'll sniff out somebody who says, "Oh, we can get this done. Let's go." We'll without a big plan, So I found in raising money over the years, you need that plan, but again, the books are written on, oh boy, you made the pitch and somebody wrote you $100 million check. It never happens that way. You got to have like 50 pitches to get at least another awareness. So the practical reality is you build that plan, and every time you're pitching, you're telling that investor, this is what I told you we were going to do. We just did this. Now we're ready to do this. And they say, hey, that's great, Esposito. I like the story, but come back next month. You come back next month and say, I told you I was going to do this. We did it. Now we want to do this. That builds a bit of interest from investors that ultimately makes it. And just to holistically coming around to your point, it all starts with what's that problem we're trying to solve, the building blocks to solve that. You get the energy around the team seeing that, and then adventures tie on to that, investors, and you get there. But then the practical side hits. Harvey, science is hard. All the easy things have been solved, and so sometimes the technology doesn't work. And then where do you go from there? You hopefully can pass those learnings on to somebody else to pick up the ball and move it forward.
Kind of going way back and then back to yesterday, a big reason I started this podcast in the first place was I kind of had a core thesis in which if I learn from the world's best, I'll become better. But also that if you take someone like yourself or a lawyer or a CEO, actress, athlete, whatever, there are commonalities in the learnings and mindsets about how people approach life. And therefore you can take that into your own life to become better and to approach problems in ways that you wouldn't have previously thought of. Like a question I like asking, and I'll probably ask you later in the podcast, is like, what is a question that I haven't asked you? And that is, I can only ask questions based on my own research, based on my own understanding, how you respond to things. And so I think by speaking to new people and sharing this podcast, people might be able to get insights they may not have previously have thought. And a commonality I've noticed initially within the realm of finance, I spoke to a lawyer yesterday. He's called Dr. Marcus Nauheim, and he's a partner at Gibson Dunn in Germany. And even now with yourself and the point that you just made is in finance in particular, there's kind of two main core things which are really important to develop a successful career. One is the key emphasis on people and relationships. And even with the rise of AI, right, people are still the forefront. When you're making a deal, you need to know that people are actually going to, when they say their word is their bond. And the second one is honesty. And we spoke extensively about this yesterday. And it's the same with you, right? That when you're in the clinical trial, it's not, oh, I need more money. It's working when it's not. It's actually saying, this is what we're doing today. This is what we're trying. This worked. This didn't work. We think we have a % chance this might work, but we can't give you any promises. And that level of honesty is so important because if you lie, it's fraud, as you can see with like Elizabeth Holmes, but it also builds trust, and it can take a lifetime to build up that relationship, but only a minute to break it, as Dr. Nauheim's words, not mine. And I think that's very important. on that basis, we've spent most of the podcast talking more holistically about your life, about your time in the army, about, fundraising, deal making, differentiating. Could you talk a little bit about the work that you do at ONL Therapeutics, why you think this cause is so important in terms of like retinal disease, and in terms of a big point that we were talking about was with regard to trials, right? And there's an element of risk of whether it does work or it doesn't work. So how do you go about getting a level of edge, differentiation, giving yourselves the best possible chance to make you the only company in the world or the best of those companies in the world to actually going about solving the biggest problems, making money for investors, helping to, evolve healthcare and help patients at the end of the day?
Yeah, sure. So I think in terms of our work at ONL and why it really matters, we were founded by our retina specialist, David Zaks, world-renowned retina specialist, and he, like many clinicians in the field, would be sitting across from a patient and say, "There's nothing more I can do for you to improve your vision. You're on a slow path to blindness, a condition called dry age-related macular degeneration." Up until just a few years ago, there was never a treatment for that. So people would be given that diagnosis 10, 15 years ago and said, "I'm sorry, you're probably going to go blind in 4 or 5 years. May happen in 2, may not happen until 10, but you're going to go blind." And so to be able to figure out that disease process and if there's a way to stop that or slow that growth is incredibly important. So that's the kind of energy and purposeful work we're on, where there are diseases that people are losing vision on, and we have the potential to put a therapeutic in line to help that. So that is that's really important purposeful work that we're on to try to really help protect vision long term. In terms of getting the edge and finding that, so scientifically it works out in drug discovery for trying to get a different mechanism of action. So in essence, how does the drug work? Can it work differently than attempts in the past? That provides your first basis for differentiation. This drug could work differently on this pathway and better than the other. So that, from a scientific standpoint, is one important way to begin differentiation. And then in terms of your comment on clinical trial design, that's where you get some smart people around the table and say, all right, what inside that bucket of, say, dry age-related macular degeneration, are there ages of patient that are best suited for it? Or what stage in that disease do we think our drug could be most effective in? And so you got to go through that work to then ultimately determine design a trial that's going to have your best chance for success, but also, Harvey, is implementable and it's fundable. You may think it works on everybody. Well, nobody's going to give you $500 million to run a 10-year trial. So you really have to make it practical as well. Say, all right, I think we can get the statistics right with 200 people for 18 months looking at this condition. Here's the investment thesis. Here's what will happen if it's successful. Let's go. So the clinical trial design at the end of the day becomes a bit practical in that, can we show efficacy and safety at an appropriate level? Because my point before, you can't study it in 1 million patients. You can't wait that long. So what's the right level that's then investable? And then you execute, and you hope the drug can deliver what you think it can.
This might be a sort of repetition of the exact same question, but what is an example of, because I would say that theory would be the same for your company versus a company that's gone bankrupt. Like in the specifics, like how do you go about managing that risk? What do the economics look like? How do you fundraise without diluting yourself too much? Like what is a way in which you could have a trial coming up, for example, and that could go really well? Obviously if the trial works out, it's going to do well, but a lot of it I think comes down to how much you raise, how little you dilute, how you actually set up the framing for it versus what a company that isn't going to be successful, what they're doing instead or not doing.
Maybe a couple things. I think we do in our world try to be as lean as we can in these. So you don't want a big bloated team at the start and try to keep yourself lean. But I will tell you, to your point, because it's a common theme, people think about raising capital. Boy, you're going to get diluted. Your percent ownership of the company, dilution stinks. I would just tell you, having done this for a while and taken a few companies over the cliff, dilution doesn't kill a company, running out of capital does. So at the end of the day, you want to put together an investment thesis, and to your point, that has a little bit more buffer in it, because nothing goes according to the base plan. It just doesn't do that. We're right now in ONL in almost a 6-month delay of getting this trial started because we've had some scale-up issues with manufacturing. So the base plan didn't say that, but we raised enough capital to have a little bit of buffer to do that. And I think it's prudent on the company to manage a little bit of buffer, but it's also prudent on investors to gut check, is this base case absolutely wishful thinking, or is this account for what will inevitably be overruns on a clinical trial? We enter the country, it takes longer from a regulatory standpoint, and you got to account for those things. It's a bit to my comment way back when, that you have to build a base plan, but the data points in front of you may cause you to adjust, course correct. And you got to be listening to those. To touch on the point you made before, nothing is perfect, and you want some transparency and honesty in not just the data, but the execution of the plan. I just sent out a note to my board today about a couple things, because you just want to be out in front of news, good or bad. You want to be on top of things quickly to make that work. I may have rambled a little off topic. Hopefully I covered that one for you.
No, not at all. So I kind of I'm going to separate things quite simply, right? So I mentioned earlier in the podcast that I was interning next summer in sales and trading. And for people that don't know, sales, you could say, are more like talking to clients. They're more personable, to use the name of my podcast, more networking focused. And trading would be more in the books, working out the amount of risk for the bank, how many more shares of Apple do they need to buy or sell, depending on what's been bought or sold already. A similar split would be general salespeople in a business versus maybe your quantitative people who would be, not as good at speaking to people, etc. But the same in your business, you're more of the CEO business focus versus having more like doctors and medical people. But kind of giving those 3 examples over time, right, as sales and trading people, that has kind of blended over time to now you're both a salesperson and you're a trading person. There was a point in time when the salespeople in a business didn't know much about the quantitative part, but with the rise of AI and tools like Lovable and Cursor and whatnot, people can now use no-code devices to be technical. And similarly, people that weren't as good at talking, people have got better at speaking. And it's the same thing with you, right? There's an amount that you can learn with AI yourself or by speaking to people to become more technical, and a doctor can become more gain more business sense. Like Y Combinator and a lot of these startup funds will only hire technical people because they think they can just learn business stuff. To what extent that's true, I guess we'll see. So on that point, right, where you've had more of a business background and you've got some of the most intelligent, most well-educated PhDs and doctors around you on this lean team, how do you balance giving your business insight and your expertise when at the same time you have people that have maybe more educated than you or have a doctorate or a PhD? It goes back to that same question from near the start of the podcast when you're on a team, people have the same goal but differing ideas. Like, how do you deal with being the more business person, CEO role while dealing with doctors?
Yeah, well, I'd say, all points of view in building a small team in a biotech are valid. You have to have good, we're in life sciences. You have to have good scientific knowledge and discovery to get there. You need capital to do it, and you need a plan. So there's points of views that need to be voiced to build that. But I will tell you what is a constant source of healthy debate on our team and other biotech companies early stage. If it's all about science, this classic scientific rubric is, let me just do another experiment. I have a question, I'm going to do another experiment. Answer that. Well, the practical side of running a company is, wait a second, we don't have an unlimited cash runway to do another experiment. And then the operational plan, or to your comments earlier, the go-to-market, it's never perfect. So that needs to have a lot of tension behind, do we really need that additional experiment, or is it validated enough and we can now move it forward? Because if we keep spending money here, we're going to run out of gas before we can commercialize it. But yet if we commercialize it now, it may not be optimal as best we want it, but you're in market, you're learning from customers, you adjust. So I would say, Harvey, all those points of view, I value scientific knowledge, all these kind of things, but at the end of the day, you got to have a good, healthy debate to figure out, folks, we can't just experiment ourselves to death. We're going to run out of money. Nobody's going to invest that. But we can't just wing it and jump in the market either. Nobody's going to buy the product. So let's figure out where we feel good enough to get there. And that's to your point before, a little bit of transparency, trust. And, at the end of the day, I found getting to market sooner, even with not the prettiest product in the world, is a lot better than sitting there thinking about making a pretty product. Because you just learn when you're in front of customers what else they may need, and before you know it, you're selling something else. So I hope that answered the question.
I want to ask you a few final short answer questions just to get through a large quantity of things in a short period of time. The first one being a dual question is, what is a reason that you're grateful today, and what is the meaning of the jar behind you?
The reason I'm grateful today, well, I would say I got a really great family support network. Wife, kids. My parents are in their 80s. They're still alive. I'm still grateful for all of that. So that foundational support that started when I was a kid, critically important today. You can't do this alone, despite all the books you read about great CEOs. Nobody does this stuff alone. I'd say I'm really grateful for that on the family background. And then the second one was about purpose today. Give me the second one. Yeah.
The second one was, what's the purpose of the jar? Like what it's, I just noticed it in your background.
The purpose of the jar. This? Yeah. Okay. No, that's a reason to be grateful. Is that where you grabbed that from? Yeah.
That's where I got that from.
It's one of those habits, right? You get up every morning, you're trying to get your head around all the problems of today. Well, I'm just going to scribble a note down. These are a couple things I'm grateful for. Chuck it in that jar. Yeah, it's pretty full.
No, that's awesome.
Good. No, that's one of those habits to keep you going, man.
No, it's that level of like being grounded, like no matter what, that like keeps you going. I'd say a similar reason I'm grateful would be family as well. I kind of already knew this, and I'm not homesick. I've traveled quite a lot around the world at this point. I've lived in like 4 different places: Little Island, Jersey, London, North Carolina, now in Sydney. And I would say that it's not just about the places you go, but the people you meet. And I think that's definitely something I've taken forward, in that you can see the coolest people and places in the world, but if you're not with people you love and care about, it's not worth it. Which leads me to my next quick question, and I hinted at this before. But what is a question that I have not asked you on this podcast, or that people often don't ask you enough, that you want to talk more about?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I'd say a little bit of what keeps, I would say, the critical dimension of leadership. What keeps hope alive in this stuff? Because it's hard, right? You're starting to build a career. I'm working on it, building a company. What that level of optimism to believe tomorrow's going to be a better day is important. And I think that question of really what keeps you leaning forward every day, that hope is an important one. And I would just say, for me, it's because I've at least gained an appreciation over time that with a solid team around, you can solve just about any problem. You can succeed on a battlefield, on a ball field, in a boardroom, in a tough biotech. If you have the right people, you can solve those problems. So that's where, even though, in even today's world today, what we're dealing with, the problem with ONL right now, I feel like tomorrow we're going to solve it. So I'm positive of that. And I think that kind of question of what keeps the energy and hope alive is an important one that I'd love to share for your folks.
And what would be the answer to that question?
I think it's just it's the proven day in, day out that you've overcome problems before. Just like in your own journey and mine, like, you know what? Been through a couple tough gut punches before. I think we can work through it, overcome these in the past, and with the right team around you, you can get there. So that's the hope that I bring to each day, saying, man, we've had a couple gunfights, we've had a tough gut punches, we've had tough technical problems, but you know what? We've survived them, and we'll get through this next one no matter what will come. Because the practical reality is, nobody's got a crystal ball of tomorrow. You can have all these strategists think about where things are going. You know as well as I do, business world changes fast, world events happen, science happens overnight. You cook something, all of a sudden you show up tomorrow and it's off the rails. You got to be able to solve it.
If I was to ask someone in 100 years' time, how would you want to be described and what would you want your legacy to be?
Yeah, that's a good one. I really think maybe two things that just Esposito came to the table with a calling for serving something bigger than himself would be important. It just wasn't about him. It was really about serving a calling bigger. And then the only other side of it was strip away titles and work. It's just I'm hoping people would say he was a pretty useful guy. Every day he showed up and just tried to be useful, you know. But the truth of it, Harvey, I hope if somebody remembers me 100 years from now, that would be pretty outstanding, just for the record. But I think a guy that was just really fundamentally believed in service something bigger than himself and just tried to be useful along the way.
My penultimate question, and you can look at any frame of time you want, 6 months, a year, 5 years, etc. What's next for you?
Yeah, that's a big one. So I think next for me is really we want to move our technology forward in ONL. We got a team that's just working really hard. We've had a tough 6 months trying to figure out a couple of these scientific problems that we now have got through. But I think 12 months from now, I'm hoping this trial is just full of patients. It's going well. We're happy. Investors are happy. Docs, patients are happy. and it's a better day 12 months from now. That would be outstanding.
And my final question, I ask this to every guest on Personable, is what is one thing that you want a listener to take away from this episode?
Well, one thing I'd love them to take away is that just because they don't read about these things, or perhaps they don't have a great podcast like you have that highlights some of these things, there are good, purposeful work, people trying to do really good, purposeful work in the world on good topics. Despite what gets the fanfare of big, bad, bold opinions, you know, most people are doing really good work like I feel my team is and I am. We're just, not all of it's going to succeed, not all of it's going to go IPO and see it on CNBC, but they're moving science forward, and for you, me, and everybody else, we need good, purposeful people moving innovation forward in healthcare to make our lives better. So I hope they remember that even though they're not reading it, have faith that there's good people doing good work to make the lives better.
One of the things that I brought up was honesty and saying things even when you didn't have to say it. And when I asked you the question with regard to fundraising and business and success, the typical answer that most people on this podcast and most people would give in general say, yeah, I've had 3 multi-billion-dollar exits, you know, I've done really well. Not that that's a common thing, but I've done really well, etc. And they wouldn't talk about the failings. But the first thing you said was like, yeah, I've made a few companies go bankrupt. And it's that level of realism which I really appreciate, because it gives the level of honesty that even people doing really well have had snapshots in their life where it didn't go as well. I love your fundamentals to business and being in the army. I hadn't thought about that point, and that's, I think, something that I want to take forward as well, that when in an organization, as well as having urgency and having that common goal of success, with regard to actually getting that means to have a goal, you should have some fundamental principles with regard to debate, with regard to sense of urgency, with regard to getting towards that goal, which keep people on the same page. Because I think when you get to the point where you just have the goal, but no means to say, you know, anyone can bring up their idea, or at the end of this meeting, right, this is the person that gets the final vote. Like my mum was the co-founder of a business, and she had a 50-50 split with her co-founder, but they had 2 businesses, and in one she had the deciding vote, and in the other he had the deciding vote. So at the end of the day, after they've discussed it forever, and they might want to keep going on forever, but at the end of the day, she would have a vote or he would have a vote, depending on which business it was. And that is so important, because you've got to have a level of decisiveness in actually just to move on. And the last thing I thought I would mention was, I like your honesty and openness with regard to trials, because I don't think a lot of people understand, you know, the capitalist system and needing to reward innovation. Not only because, you know, investors need to be happy, but that people won't put their capital up in the first place, and innovation won't actually happen unless it's rewarded in the right manner. So anyway, I feel hugely honored to have had you on the podcast today. I feel like I've learned a lot. So thank you so much for coming on today, David.
Harvey, thanks for having me. It's great to get to know you, and wish you all the best down the road. You're doing great things. Terrific.